Hi there, my name is August. I've never made a video before. Let's talk about the Dukha people of northern Mongolia, shall we? Now, we've spent some time studying these folks a couple weeks ago, but their way of life, and especially their relationship with the countries surrounding them, just fascinated me. I felt I had to dig a little deeper and find out why their culture is currently at risk of disappearing. After my research, I've come to find that the cultural decline of the Dukha has less to do with them as a people than who governs them. Before we get into the current situation that the Dukha faced, I feel it's always important to learn a little bit of history and context, and that's not just because I'm a history nerd. It's hard to help people if you don't know anything about them. So, here's a brief summary of the Dukha and how they got here. The Dukha are a small group of nomadic reindeer herders that presently live within the borders of Mongolia, northwest of Lake Kovsgol. They're one of a handful of nomadic groups in the region that anthropologists and ethnographers often lump together as either Tuvans when discussing geography or Uyghur-speaking peoples when discussing language. These peoples are likely descendants from migrating groups of Turkic and Scythian nomads, as well as ancient taiga-dwelling tribes who have lived in the region for millennia. They existed in relative obscurity for centuries after the Turkic migrations into the region, from about the 6th to 13th centuries. They were not a large or influential group of people, satisfied to keep to themselves and exist in the Tuvan steppe in a state of relative pacifism. This would change during the expansion of Chinggis Khan's Mongol Empire. The ancestors of the modern Dukha were caught up in a political struggle when a rival of Chinggis was defeated in battle and retreated into the lands of the Tuvans. Occupied with more intense conquests elsewhere, Chinggis sent his son Jochi to pacify his foe. For the following 150 years or so, the region was under the control of the Mongol Empire proper and the successor Yuan dynasty established by Kublai Khan. Both empires would eventually suffer entropy and collapse under their own weight, but the people of the Tuvan steppe remained. From the 15th to 17th centuries, the region fell under the control of various warlords who claimed grandiose titles yet were unable to make any change in the region. Russian explorers from west of the Ural Mountains entered the region for the first time in the mid-1600s and would begin the process of diplomatic relationships with various tribal authorities. Envoys of Tuvans also made contact with Tibet and various other kingdoms in the region, but the most important and influential for Tuvan, and by extension Dukha history, was the successor to the Yuan dynasty, the Qing. The Qing took the mandate of heaven from the Yuan, and after reconsolidating power from the previous government, set off upon new imperial ambitions. The Qing would expand their influence northwards, claiming territory across the Gobi Desert, and following diplomatic talks with the Russian Empire about their respective spheres of influence, the Qing would claim the taiga where most of the Tuvan people lived. There, they would remain under Qing rule until 1911, when the state of affairs in East Asia became, shall we say, tumultuous. In 1911, China ended its 2,500-year span of continuous imperial rule. A violent revolution broke out against the Chinese government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and conflict erupted across the Chinese mainland. The region known as Outer Mongolia was no different and attempted to break away from Qing under the rule of a man who took the name Khan for his own. The region was contested for a while, but the Qing state would eventually fall to the nationalists, and the remoteness of Mongolia meant that reclaiming the province was more trouble than it was worth. Once more, the Dukha would be ruled by an oppressive and militaristic government who cared little for the general population and even less for the indigenous population on the borderlands with Russia. Speaking of Russia, the Chinese Revolution looked so fun that the Russian proletariat decided to have their own uprising. In 1917, facing the horrors of the Great War and an inept czar, a pair of revolutions broke out. The first was to oust the imperial government, and the second was to replace it with a communist one. The Dukha likely watched these developments with increasing anxiety, as their people and the lands they occupied were directly in the middle of two unstable and revolutionary governments, and both the Soviets and China felt that the Tuvan taiga was in their sphere of influence. It would be the Soviets who would claim influence over the Dukha lands. Despite most Dukha living in independent Mongolia, the country would become a puppet state of the USSR and have its own communist revolution in 1921. Conflict would actually spill over into Tuva proper for a time. the region would gain independence as the Tuvan People's Republic, but was still firmly a puppet state of the communist dictatorships surrounding them. Both the Soviet and Mongolian states would soon enact major economic and social reforms to conform to their new ideology. While many of these reforms began in urban centers, as the 20th century continued, reforms pushed upon more rural regions. Overcome with a revolutionary fervor and a distaste for that which did not conform, the Mongolian government forcibly relocated the Dukha 5 times between 1927 and 1956. Each time, however, the Dukha returned to their ancestral lands in the span of a few years, unwilling to be isolated from their taiga. They found some respite from oppression for a few decades, existing in the Tuvan People's Republic, but when it was annexed by the Soviet Union in 1944, the Dukha people were once again split by the borders of totalitarian states. As new members of Soviet society, they were set upon by commissars and ideological politicians who used unfair collectivization tactics to claim state ownership of almost all their material possessions. In a further attempt to make their way of life obsolete, the vast reindeer herds of the Dukha were collectivized as state property, and the nomadic Dukha were forced into a sedentary lifestyle. The Soviets constructed a small fishery and village on the banks of the Zagan Nur to settle the native peoples, but resistance to Soviet rule was common, and production never grew enough to be noteworthy. This would be the life for the Dukha for the following decades, existing and working in poor conditions, deprived of their livelihood by an ideological power more focused on the means of production rather than who worked it. At this point, one can see an obvious trend in the history of the Dukha people, and by extension, those of Tuva and the surrounding taiga. They've never had the agency to govern themselves directly. While this is an issue that is faced by many small communities, it's still an injustice that the Dukha have had to face for centuries, and it's one that shows little signs of going away. There have been glimmers of hope for the Dukha, though. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, and with it, the restrictive borders that were established between Russia and Mongolia. The Dukha were free to migrate across state lines as Moscow was dealing with the dumpster fire that was Russian politics in the early 90s. And the Mongolian state was also occupied with problems of its own. The Dukha were simply forgotten about for a few years, until they became embroiled in yet another struggle for self-determination. Around the turn of the millennia, the Mongolian state became increasingly worried about its dwindling natural resources that were being harvested by opportunistic groups taking advantage of post-Soviet confusion in government. In a response, Mongolia created several national parks known as strictly protected areas. These regions do not allow the presence of humans, and hunting and fishing is forbidden. It was likely not a coincidence that around half the ancestral lands of the Dukha were included in these strictly protected areas. This was likely done in an effort to keep what it was considered an unruly population under surveillance and in a more manageable region. This brings us to the position the Dukha find themselves in today. A dwindling population under the boot of several state governments and still dealing with the old legacy of the Soviet Union. Now, most of the struggles forced upon the Dukha have been done so by state institutions with an agenda, and very little information regarding the Dukha exists that hasn't been published by a government agency or a Western anthropologist working on their thesis. Now, don't get me wrong, this information is fantastic and often very accurate, but I felt it didn't cover the whole story. Specifically, why there's been no pushback by the greater Mongolian public who have seen Dukha culture just disappear over the past couple decades. And I spent more time than I would like to admit looking for sources that cover the potential Mongolian response to cultural erasure before remembering, wait a minute, I work with a Mongolian guy. His name is Mook, and after a lot of pressuring, I finally managed to get an interview with him. My goal was to find out what the average Mongolian knew about the Dukha and what they felt about their disappearance. Way to throw a wrench in the machine, huh? Well, in any case, I did talk with him a handful of times about the Dukha, or as he knows them, Zatan. His perspective was interesting, being aware of the Dukha while also admitting he knew very little outside what he had been taught offhandedly in school. He seemed indifferent about the struggles of the Dukha, instead repeating several times the struggles Mongolia faced itself. According to Mook, the country is dying. His words. The lack of opportunity outside the capital has forced many young people into the sole urban center of the country, and many, like himself, even choose to emigrate elsewhere. From his point of view, the tragedy of the Dukha's decline is not as special as the culture of Mongolia as a whole is dying. If global economic trends continue the way they were, Mongolia will eventually become a Central Asian backwater. Well, that's depressing. What do we do next? The issue goes far deeper than simply an indigenous culture being deprived of their traditional land rights. In order to fully restore the Dukha, the country of Mongolia itself must be revitalized. Foreign investment into Mongolia and resource extraction and other industries could provide the economic jumpstart to revitalize the economy. The solution for Dukha conservation is getting more money into the hands of the people. Remedy the short-term economic worries, and they will be more likely to see the people within their own country being erased. Tragically, this is not a unique position the Dukha are in. Countless indigenous groups are suffering or disappearing, those around them unable to see or care because of their own struggles. In all instances, the solution is to bring up everyone, to provide people with a comfortable existence and a means to life, and hope that they will do the same for others. People have the capacity to care, and a little financial security is all it takes. It's with this that I ask you to think about where your money is going and redistribute if you have the means. Thank you.